I've been previously on the board with the Nova Scotia Woodlot owners and operators and done this stuff I did it for free for a lot of years, and now they pay me to do it, so it's a little bit nicer. But I always say if this could be my only job in the woods, I would just do nothing but this. I like doing outreach work and just walk and talk about trees more than anything. What's going on in behind me here, this would be one. I don't know anything about the history of this, whether this was probably through some type of harvest or wind event or anything like that, but just looking at the trees, guessing somewhere 30, 40-ish years ago, kind of went down. I would say no follow-up silviculture or anything. Definitely wasn't, well, it could have been planted and failed, but you look around, there's a lot of lots of aspen, I know that just from walking up in a little bit, there was some white birch, that type of stuff. So that would be what we would call early successional species. So something that comes back. They're really specialized in coming back after like a big disturbance. So whether it was harvesting or it could have been 1,000 years ago, you'd still have stands like this that came back after hurricanes or fires or anything else. So you kind of start to notice a little bit of the successional dynamics going on already, where you've got this overstory of things like aspens and white birch and everything. I did notice a bunch of fir in here, which is maybe a little bit surprising, but it's more of an intolerant hardwood stand. But when you start to look around a little bit in the understory, you can see this like one nice tall red spruce. There's a few other, all kinds of red spruce coming up in the understory. It's nice, some hemlock and that type of stuff there. I always say late successional, that's basically just like the climax forest. If you left it alone and didn't have a big wind event, and if we came back in 500 years, that's what you would expect to see there. So, like the red spruce, hemlocks probably. I know there's some yellow birch and stuff up in here, so kind of like that. What would be typical of an old growth or an older forest in here. You can kind of see that even if you do nothing in a stand like this, you're going to have all these aspens. They'll start to die off. You'll probably get another cohort of aspens come up, but as they die off, it's also going to give room for the spruce, hemlock, whatever hardwoods are in there. And then the other really nice one that you start to see, they're super easy to find this time of year because the oaks hold their leaves so long, as there's lots and lots of red oak in through here, and I even see some pine and everything else.
They're almost like a cover crop, like you talk about in the garden. So they're the species that grow up quickly but also die out first, and it creates the desired shade and conditions for the longer lived species to come up underneath. And in softwood and mixedwood stands, we see it with white pine and hemlock and red spruce typically as those under species that will overtake this. So this stand will grow up, die out early, whether there's a disturbance or not, or just its own senescence, its own old age for that early crop. But it's created the desired shade conditions for those longer lived species to come up. And if you don't harvest, all the stuff that dies becomes organic matter in the soil and makes the soil richer and recycles nutrients.
The idea with climate change is that we're going to lose some of the more boreal species, your balsam firs, white birch even, that like a little bit of the colder weather, and then species that are a little bit more of a southern affinity, so red oaks, like the three biggest ones that we always tell everyone that we know are going to do well, or that are predicted to do really well under climate change, would be red oak, red maple, and white pine. So that's kind of our native species. That there's others, red spruce, they don't know for sure. Sugar maple, yellow birch it might depend a little bit. They think they're gonna do okay, but then there's species like white oak, which is they've got bur oak, which is a white oak species in the St. John River Valley. And then white oaks are fairly common, especially in like southern Maine and stuff. So it's not terribly far away, but the thinking is that our climate's going to warm so fast that it's not going to move fast enough to basically keep up with it. And is that something that we think eventually it's going to get here anyway? So maybe we'll give it a hand and we'll start to look at plantings. We have a little bit of like an experimental silviculture program that we're doing too, and some of these types of stands are part of what we're looking at in that. How could we do some silviculture work, not necessarily just to grow wood for harvesting, although that would be part of the outcome, but how can we help this stand along to kind of develop to more of that late successional type thing. So we're looking at doing some work. This would be probably a little bit too short, but as that understory comes up some, could we go through and do like a pre-commercial thinning, which typically you would do after a clear cut, just with a spacing saw. It's like weeding out your carrots, spacing your carrots out in your garden. Do something like that, but also go through maybe with a chainsaw. Like you see, it's not a nice looking tree, but there's a good yellow birch there with some, I think there's red maple or whatever. could we thin the understory and then also do just a little bit of crop tree release in there for, you know, the few yellow birch. I see a couple hemlocks and stuff like that. That's not something that's currently funded, but we want to try and do the work to see, one, if it would be successful, and also figure out what it would cost. In that, you know, maybe it's something that down the road would become a funded activity, or maybe it's something that a landowner wants to pay. You know, you might not pay to have 50 hectares done, but if you could hire somebody to come through for a couple days with a saw and it costs you, you know, a few $100s a year, and you can pick away at it. How could we do some work like that? We talked just for a second there a little bit about like successional dynamics and stuff, but you're starting to see it here where this is probably, you know, a little bit of wind damage from the storm, but it didn't take everything out. But you're starting to see, you know, a lot of this is white birch that, if you look at the one in behind Christie here, starting to give some indication that these white birches are getting a little bit closer to the end of their natural life cycle. If you look up in the top of the tree, it's starting to die out and stuff. I see a few of them like that. White birch depends on the site and everything, but one of the biggest problems with the white birch especially is that they don't, if they grow really tight, they like to stay tight, and as soon as it starts to open up, I always say they get, I always call it the sun scald, I don't know, but if you open up too much around a white birch and they get a bunch more sunlight than what they're used to, they tend to burn off and you'll see the tops die out. That first one and the next one, nice, gorgeous, straight. So those would be acceptable growing stock. They're probably going to grow a saw log and everything. The next one here in the middle is, you know, it's a little bit squirrely. Maybe it would have a saw log in the bottom, but then it gets pretty crooked and stuff. But in a stand like this one, we've kind of taken the stance that even though it's not acceptable and that it's going to grow a saw log, it's of the species that we want here. There's nothing that says that tree's going to die. It's got decent crown development and everything else. We call it ecological growing stock. And basically, that's a way of saying it's acceptable, but not under the normal terms of acceptable, that it's going to make a saw log, but it's acceptable for every other reason. It's the right species, it's got good crown development, everything else. It's a healthy young tree. I'm pretty confident we're going to do a harvest on that site. I carry paint with me and paint mark all those trees so that the guys in the harvester know that that's a tree I don't want to see damaged. I want to see it kept for retention, just because, like I say, even with that yellow birch, maybe it's just going to be firewood someday, but it's also just a gorgeous seed source. It's something that's good and wind firm. It probably should hold up through most storms, and it's going to keep some cover on there too. So we're marking a lot of stuff like that. Other ecological growing stock trees might be, you know, a big old aspen that might not stay alive through the next harvest, but I can already see where the woodpeckers are at it. They're developing cavities in the trees, and I think it's going to be a good nest tree or something. We'll call that an ecological one too, in that, sure, it might die, but as long as it stays standing, it's good habitat. It's a nice snag tree. We talk about a little bit about forest restoration. One of the things that I've run into a whole bunch of times now is folks with old fields that are starting to go fallow, and what do you do? And you know, people talking about trying to plant sugar maple and stuff like that in an old field, but to me, the best thing to do on those is, it's so hard to reforest an old field anyway, so put species in that you know are going to do well on those, and then instead of managing it like a plantation that you're going to clear cut in 50 years, you can just change your management approach a little bit. So if it was me, Norway or white spruce would be the only thing that I really start to think about, until it gets up, you know, even this tall. If you get them all planted in there, maybe even if you planted them a little bit tight, you're just really trying to shade the grass out and turn it back to a forest. And then you can talk about doing, you know, even if it's this tall, or you maybe do your pre-commercial thinning. Well, if you did a pre-commercial thinning in it, maybe cut a few small little gaps and then start thinking about, you know, do I plant a few sugar maples or oaks or something like that in there, and you can create some diversity out of them. Our fire conditions are going to get worse in Nova Scotia, but you still can't change the fact that we really don't get a lot of lightning, and especially we mostly get sheet lightning, right? So it doesn't matter how dry it is. If there's no way to start the fire, you're probably not going to have it. So fires are, whatever the stats are, 99% human caused in Nova Scotia, and that's probably going to stay the same. And I'm completely on board with what Dave said. Like, if you're super worried about fire, if you've got a woodlot that, you know, your road just comes up through your driveway and into your woodlot, we'll control the access that way. And then, you know, if you had one, it's super common to have, you know, even if it's not a legal one, there's an illegal four-wheeler trail or something that cuts across. Yeah, I'd be doing the same thing. Same here, you know. Public, it's seems like most folks are pretty respectful here, but it takes one person walking through, yeah, with a cigarette and flick it off in the woods in the dry duff, and you know, you get some bigger stuff like this dead and on the ground. You know, on a site like this, everyone's going to walk the trails. You're not too worried about a bunch of dead stuff further off into the woods. It's about controlling it around access points.